Hello, my name is Dennis Speed. I want to welcome everybody to the Thursday night fireside chat with Lyndon LaRouche for the LaRouche Organization for Thursday, April 22nd. Now, as I think everybody on the call would know, we are now about to begin the second day of this summit called by President Biden, which Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have shown up for. It is itself a terrible occasion because of it being an attempt to organize the world around the absurd notion of global warming and climate change. We're going to be getting into and discussing what our role has been. Of course, we've had our pamphlet out, which I trust many of you have both received and have been distributing. And the pamphlet is intended to challenge the fundamental assumptions, not merely around climate change and global warming, but actually the fundamental assumptions of the entire present form of organization of the transatlantic system. Now, on Saturday, May 8th, we're going to be having a conference called The Moral Collapse of the Transatlantic World Cries Out for a New Paradigm. There's great risk that we find ourselves in, which has been recently spoken to by President Vladimir Putin, actually only yesterday in a speech that he gave to the Russian nation. He said many things in that speech, but one of the passages I want to just refer to is this. He talks about the actions being taken by agencies, particularly of British intelligence in the United States. He doesn't name the two, to depose regimes in the world. And he says, you can think whatever you like of, say, Ukrainian President Yanukovych or Maduro in Venezuela. I repeat, you can like or dislike them, including Yanukovych, who almost got killed, too, and was removed from power via an armed coup. That was in 2014. You can have your own opinion of the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko's policies, but the practice of staging coups d'etat and planning political assassinations, including those of high-ranking officials, well, this goes too far. This is beyond any limits. And he also stated, everyone pretends nothing is happening. He went on to say, the 5 nuclear countries bear special responsibility. I hope that the initiative on a personal meeting of the heads of state of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, which we proposed last year, will materialize and will be held as soon as the epidemiological situation allows. Now, of course, that's the proposal that Helga Sepp-LaRouche referred to all of last year in the series of conferences which we began actually last April at the time that it was the 75th anniversary of the meeting of the Russian and American forces, military forces at the Elbe River in Germany in 1945. And we held a set of conferences last year in June and September and so on in order to try to argue for that perspective of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin in particular sitting down together to discuss the ways in which the world could be organized for an effort greater than the effort of the Second World War to deal with both the coronavirus problem and as well the other epidemic of the financial collapse and the process of bailouts, which was only monetary. There's a few things just to point out to you. The value of the United States stock market has now reached $49 trillion. And the debt of the United States is at an astounding $127.7 trillion. Now, just to give you a sense of to put that in perspective, if you were back in the period of 1929 when the stock market collapsed, we had a debt of $17 billion, and it was only 16%. If you compared what we were producing in the country, the debt was about 16%. If you come up to 2008, by that point, we got to the point of having a $10 trillion debt, and we were at a ratio of 68%. GDP to debt to GDP, gross domestic product. It was 2008. That's when we had the bank bailout. It was 10 trillion. Okay. Then you get to now. Let's come up to now, and what you have was this 27 trillion in 2020. What you're talking about is that you're talking about levels that are amazing, because we're now at 129% of debt to credit ratio. And the normal idea about default, investors start worrying about default when your debt to GDP ratio is greater than 77%. We're now at 129%. Now those are just figures. So let's now take the figures out of our mind and let's look at what this means humanly. What has happened is that our country is in a state of crisis in which there's little or no confidence in the ability of government to tell the truth, and to therefore organize the citizens to, despite their own skepticism, get behind a policy of economic growth. So what we find ourselves in is a peculiar circumstance in which we don't have productivity. Only about 5% of any of the activity that goes on in the American economy is actually tied to physical production at all. And of course, America 75 years ago was the productive powerhouse of the world. We were able to actually run a two-front war in the Pacific and the Atlantic, and also supply the necessary logistics and materiel to the Soviet Union and other countries in the Second World War, and that's why that war could be won. Today, we are at literally 1/20th of that capacity. And so we're on the verge of self-destruction. But we could reverse this. Now, the way we could reverse it, and this is the thing that I think is important that was said in our briefing today, said that ironically, though the climate summit is a terrible occasion, the heads of state of major nations meeting could be turned into a collaboration for mutual benefit, which would be vital for the entire world. So that's China, Russia, India, the United States. But we have to actually make that happen. And it will be our economic policies, the policies of Lyndon LaRouche, which will basically determine whether that occurs. Now, I want to say one thing and then turn this over to Megan. Lyndon LaRouche wrote many different documents on economics in his life, in several books on the topic, and he emphasized what he called physical economy. So this has nothing to do with money. Money is a vehicle merely for the distribution and exchange of goods, the reconciliation of accounts, but it should have no intrinsic value of its own. Money is an idiot. Money is simply a way of representing a dynamic process of economic activity expressed in physical productivity and in the increase of the potential for physical economic productivity as expressed in science and technology. Now, there are two different outlooks on the economy which have been in contention since the 17th century. One was that advocated by John Locke, who is often referred to as the so-called inspiration for the U.S. Constitution. He was not that. He was one of the co-founders of the Royal Africa Company, which was the company that began shall we say, expanded the African slave trade. So he was that. And he was an employee of the British East India Company. So he represented one orientation. Opposed to him was the German thinker and statesman Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who at the age of 26 invented the science of physical economy in an essay called Society and Economy, and directly opposed Locke personally by writing a book against Locke's book on human understanding. Locke's book was called Essay on Human Understanding, and Leibniz wrote what he called the New Essays on Human Understanding. And the idea was that the difference was the image of man. That Locke believed that you had people who were, as they say, born as a blank slate, and you sort of wrote on them what you wished them to think or experience in some fashion, wrote on them what they thought, what they were to think. Leibniz did not believe that. Leibniz believed that there was an intrinsic character to human beings, if you will, a divine spark that allowed them, because of the inherent genius of the human being, to change and transform nature in a dynamic fashion, and to change and transform themselves. And that was a different idea. And he, that is Leibniz, was the inspiration for Benjamin Franklin, who studied Leibniz partially because of his relationship to James Logan, Pennsylvania, who had one of the largest libraries in the colonies. And it was Franklin and his work, particularly in the sciences, that pioneered or became, shall we say, the realization of Leibniz's idea of man. And that's what you see in the Declaration of Independence and also in the Constitution of the United States. Sure, there were problems. And yes, there had to be a perfection of that. And yes, there were problems with the 3/5 clause and all these other things. But these things were fought out in a set of conventions, a set of conferences by the founders. In this time, in 2021, here's the paradox. Russia and China more approximate the ideas of the American system than the United States itself, which is diverging from it toward the idea of man expressed by Locke. And that's our problem. Our problem is to change that, to bring the United States back to what it actually used to represent. And the battleground we are choosing to do that, we're calling it the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites in terms of an organization, but the battleground is in the mind on the questions of epistemology, on the question of why is it the case that the world needs more people? Why is it the case that wealth is the highest expression of wealth is the individual human creative mind, and that therefore more people of that type being born is the essence of profit, if you will, or the basis of generating profit for any economy, which is, of course, is an idea which is outrageous as far as most people are concerned, and certainly might make the environmentalists who hate the fact that people are breathing out all that dirty carbon dioxide, and would not make them happy. So tonight what we want to do is to, given that we're in the middle of this Earth Day Summit Conference, is to challenge these fundamental ideas and to ask that you would follow us down that pathway of thinking about these things to help us and assist us in the job we have in the next 16 days of organizing that conference on the moral collapse of the transatlantic system cries out for a new paradigm. So now we're going to hear from Megan, who's doing our primary presentation. We'll follow that by questions and discussion. So, Megan?
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're very clear.
Great. Okay. So a couple of days ago, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, in discussions with colleagues, she characterized the strategic situation as follows. She said, it's dangerous, polarized, interesting, and hopeful. All of the above at the same time. Now, I think that's pretty accurate. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to mention a few other elements of the strategic picture. And as I go through them, I want you to think particularly about exactly what Dennis was bringing up, exactly about this view of man as the difference of the view of man between Leibniz and Locke, but particularly the view of man of Locke, which is the view of man of the ideology of geopolitics, which has taken hold of United States policymaking. So people may know that last week, several weeks after President Biden called Vladimir Putin a killer on television, last week the Biden administration announced sanctions against Russia, which include sanctions against the primary market for ruble-denominated debt, sanctions against some specific individuals. We are expelling 10 Russian diplomats from the United States, and so on and so forth. Now, why? Why? There's a real answer to that, but what was the given reason why? Well, the given reason or reasons include Russia's supposedly malign and aggressive activity and actions with respect to Ukraine. They include the completely debunked and false Afghan bounty story. They include the also debunked and false SolarWinds hacking lie, and so on and so forth. But what's the real why? What underlies this? Well, in the statement announcing these sanctions, the White House said that Russia poses a, quote, unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. Now, along with this is talk, once again, of Ukraine joining NATO, which is a clear red line for Russia. And the Russians have pushed back. Dennis already mentioned what President Putin said in his speech yesterday. They're responding in kind. They're expelling 10 U.S. diplomats. They've recommended strongly that the U.S. ambassador return to the United States for consultations, which he did today. So you have that. Now, this is simultaneous to a revival of the Obama-era policy toward Asia of the pivot to the Pacific, of provocations against China. And this includes a recent announcement by the State Department that the U.S. ought to reconsider how we ought to be relating to Taiwan. Again, a clear red line for China. Now, as part of that environment, it was announced yesterday that NATO is going to be holding a summit on June 14th. And Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, said of this, he said, quote, "This is a unique opportunity to reinforce NATO as the enduring embodiment of the bond between Europe and North America." Okay, fine. But what are they going to discuss there? Well, the topics include, quote, Russia's aggressive actions, the threat of terrorism, cyber attacks, et cetera, and the rise of China. So take a step back. What is going on? How should Russia and China and the nations caught in between hear these things? Now, the kind of passion you hear coming from Stoltenberg and Blinken and Biden, for what it's worth, against Russia, denouncing Russia and China, that kind of passion, or let me put it this way, where is that level of passion for the situation in Syria and in Yemen? Two countries, for example, which have been completely destroyed by a geopolitical game which is being carried out by American actors, among others, which is aimed at larger targets like Russia and China. And just to mention, the situation in Syria is dire. Cardinal Zanari on the ground in Syria made a statement a couple of weeks ago that 90% of the population in Syria has been plunged into poverty as a result of 10 years of warfare, sanctions, the pandemic, and so forth. A third of the population has fled the country. Over 12 million people don't have access to food and heating, and it goes on and on. In Yemen, which has undergone, I think it's now 6 years of warfare, of bombing campaigns by a Saudi-led coalition with American military hardware and intelligence support, Yemen has been turned from a relatively modern nation into one which is suffering an incredible famine crisis, especially among its children because of blockades of food and medical supplies. So you have that. Now, underlying, but really driving all of this is exactly what Dennis mentioned at the beginning. And I think this is something which people tend to forget because it's not usually discussed. And that's the fact that the entire global financial system, this IMF, World Bank, Wall Street system, is completely, utterly bankrupt. It's rotten. It's empty. It collapsed more than 10 years ago, and it was propped up, sort of, by bailouts and by the looting, the expropriation of the population. Now, I want to give you just a very quick example. Dennis already mentioned these completely astounding figures of this debt to any semblance of actual production. Take the value, or at least the nominal on paper value of the derivatives holding of U.S. banks. It's almost $200 trillion. Now, derivatives are nothing. They're pieces of paper. They're gambling debt, which are traded back and forth in microseconds. $200 trillion of junk paper on the books of U.S. banks against a GDP, for what it's worth, a GDP figure of $20 trillion. So this is a bubble which is primed to blow at any moment, and we saw rumblings, I think it was a week or two ago, by Archegos Capital Management, this hedge fund, which collapsed because of these stupid leveraged financial pieces of paper, but you immediately saw collapses in much larger international banks like Credit Suisse. So this could blow any day, and no one is talking about it except the central bankers, who know very well exactly the condition of the financial system. Back in September of 2019, at a meeting at Jackson Hole sponsored by the Federal Reserve, the world's central bankers got together and, led by people like Mark Carney, who at that time was the head of the Bank of England, and alongside him the heads of the largest hedge funds in the world, announced that the financial system was going to have to undergo financial regime change, meaning they said that the reins of policy making had to be taken out of the hands of elected government and put into the hands of the central bankers. So how are they carrying that out? Total bailouts, as we've seen with these tranches of bailouts that have been tacked on to the centerpieces of the emergency pandemic bills. But more than that, the Great Reset, the Green New Deal, this what my friend Paul Gallagher calls Dearth Day Summit at the White House. So I wanted to go through that not only because it's extremely important to have that in your mind, but also you have to see it as a one. You have to see it as a whole. These are not separate events or separate crises. These are not separate, crazy congressman over here, crazy banker over there. This is a single collapse system. And Helga LaRouche continues to insist that people have to wake up. She said this is a civilizational breakdown. Geopolitics, the view of man that's embodied in geopolitics, the view of Locke, the view that most people are born to serve as slaves, that thinking has failed. The thinking behind it is false. It's barbaric. The universe disagrees with that. But if we don't stop going along with it, if we don't break from that and completely change policy to make a positive act for a completely different policy, our civilization will have failed by its own hand. And Lyndon LaRouche warned many times, particularly in 2014, in the more recent period, which is very much like today, that if we don't stop this, we will end in thermonuclear war. That's what we're facing today. So what I want to get into, geopolitics has failed. It's evil. So what do we replace it with? What is the actual nature of man on this planet, in this universe? What do we have to understand about the human species to qualify ourselves to get humanity out of this crisis, and not just to complain? Now, around 2014, that time period I mentioned, Lyndon LaRouche began talking in a very interesting way about the issue of national sovereignty. And this is my entry point for what I want to bring up tonight. Then now, this time period was when you had the nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa form the BRICS alliance, which was explicitly for development, to create credit-generating mechanisms and other international agreements for economic development. It was also the time period that China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, and nations began joining it. And at that time, LaRouche said, we're at the point at which conflict among nations means thermonuclear war, and therefore conflict among nations, war conflict among nations is an impossibility. Therefore, national sovereignty has to take on a new meaning. He said, and LaRouche said, national sovereignty isn't really the final word. Not that nations shouldn't exist. They should. They must. Not that people aren't different and regions don't have different needs. We don't speak different languages and have different political systems. But he said, as opposed to geopolitics, which sees one nation's rise as inherently a threat to any other nation, instead of that, a sense of common human interest, common human progress had to subsume the interests of any individual nation. Now, that, first of all, I think that's an extremely profound, prescient notion. And it's not only something forced onto the table by the inevitability of thermonuclear warfare, but it's also true. It also reflects something true in natural law about the nature of human beings. Humanity on the planet is one single entity. We are a single species, scientifically. We're not separate beings, separate species of masters and slaves, or of rich nations and poor nations, or capitalists and socialists. And we're not separate species of people who suffer and people who don't care. We're a single entity, with a single geological effect on the planet, which I'll get into. So that we can begin to consider how to build a new, truthful conception of the nature of humanity to be the basis of policy making, what I want to talk about briefly as I can, is the work of two great geniuses. The first one is Vladimir Vernadsky, and the second one is Lyndon LaRouche. So first, Vernadsky. Vernadsky was, as you might have guessed, a Russian. He had also Ukrainian background. He was born in 1863, and he died in 1945. Vernadsky was a biogeochemist. Now, what's that mean, right? A biogeochemist. What that meant is that Vernadsky studied the evolution of the chemistry of the planet. Now, I don't mean chemistry in terms of, funny-looking liquids from your chemistry class, but chemistry in terms of the organization, the distribution, and the origin of Earth's chemical and mineralogical makeup. So he looked at that, for example, from the standpoint of very, very long time-scale geologic processes, things like volcanic eruptions, things like the kinds of mineral-forming processes that occur deep within the Earth's crust at very high pressures and temperatures. These minerals are brought to the surface by tectonic activity. So you've had a whole billions of years of history of the Earth where the minerals and the chemicals of the Earth were shaped by geologic, non-living processes. Now, he also then looked at and asked about life. He looked at the much relatively shorter time scale processes of life on the scale of millions or hundreds of millions of years, and how the biosphere has changed nature. How has the biosphere shaped the Earth? Now, he also studied the geological effect of humanity, which I'll get to in a minute. But first, life. Vernadsky's take on life was somewhat unique. He did not ask the perpetual question, what is life? What is life? And you've had all sorts of weird answers to that over the millennia, from these really mystical life force whatever to other strange answers. Vernadsky asked a much more scientific question. What does life do? What does the process of life do? So I want you to imagine in your mind a living organism. Any living organism. It can be a plant, a bacterium, your own body. The way that Vernadsky describes it is any living organism has an indissoluble connection to the environment around it, to the biosphere. Now that living thing, that connection, as long as the living thing is living, it is constantly exchanging material with the outside world. Through respiration, we inhale and we exhale, through nutrition. And in fact, there's nothing constant about the material that makes up your body, which I think is totally fascinating. So our bodies contain almost every chemical element on the periodic table, but the atoms that make up our body are constantly in flux, to the point that one estimate I read is that there is a complete 100% turnover of the material of your body in about every 5 years. So 5 years from now, no atom that's currently in your body will be there any longer. You're going to be made up of entirely new stuff. Now, from that standpoint, a living thing is not a thing. It's a dynamic. It's in motion. It's what Vernadsky called a dynamic equilibrium. It sucks in material from the environment very selectively, gets rid of what it doesn't need, holds on to what it does, and it changes that material. There are molecules and compounds created within living things that aren't created outside of the living body. Now, that process over the course of hundreds of millions and even billions of years has profoundly reorganized nature. It's created completely new chemical deposits. It's concentrated elements such as calcium, such as iron. In fact, the iron deposits in the Midwest, Michigan area were put there by bacteria who gobbled up all this iron and then died. So life has profoundly reorganized the planet. And what Vernadsky concluded is that over time, over evolutionary time, the rate and the power with which life has changed the planet has been increasing. And that's been accomplished through the biosphere developing successive sets of more highly developed organisms. You had very early single cellular life, and now we have very complex multicellular life such as mammals and so forth, with much more powerful metabolisms. So that's the biosphere. Then take human life. And Vernadsky observed that human life does something very different. We have had, and actually Vernadsky in the 1940s said that we're reaching the point where human life is about to surpass the biosphere in terms of the sheer volume of material that we're affecting each year, which is incredible. But how have we done this? We haven't done it so much as a biological species. Our bodies are not that impressive in terms of how we change nature. Here's what Vernadsky said about it in 1945. He said, "Here, a new riddle has arisen before us. Thought is not a form of energy. How, then, can it change material processes?" Thought. So what Vernadsky observed is that for the first time in the history of the Earth, with the appearance of humanity, you had this reorganization of Earth not because of biological processes, but because of cognition, because of ideas, which were manifest in the social organization of a species. We organize ourselves into nations with economies to carry out work based on our discoveries. Now, I think this is incredibly beautiful, not for many reasons. One of them is that it goes completely against the idea that nature is in some pristine state that we shouldn't change. Vernadsky said, no, that's exactly why we were put here, to change nature in a way that the biosphere can't, and to bring it to a higher state of existence. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for time reasons. I want to now, with that in your mind, with what Vernadsky observed as a scientist about the impact of the human species on the Earth, I want you to take that idea and I want to look briefly to the discoveries of Lyndon LaRouche in the science of physical economy. And Dennis already hinted at this, but if you had the misfortune to suffer through an economics class in school, in high school or university, you have my profound condolences. because what's taught in economic classrooms today and for the past couple of decades has had exactly nothing to do with economics. What it has had to do with are the fantasies of these, how do I make a lot of money quick by screwing over my neighbor schemes. But that has nothing to do with economics. Lyndon LaRouche was by far the most successful economist and economic forecaster of his lifetime and to this day. And he said economics has nothing to do with money. Economics is the science of humanity's physical development of higher and higher powers in and over nature. So I want to read a few sentences here from a speech that he made in 2003. He was speaking to a room full of young people. He said, "The root of an economy is man. There is no economy among animals. An economy reflects a characteristic of people, of the human individual, the difference between an individual and the beast. That is, these cognitive powers by which we discover universal physical principles, derive new technologies, or apply technologies based on these principles. We apply them to our problems, and therefore we find that through our physical efforts, we are able to produce more wealth than it costs to keep us in the process of production. Therefore, it is the power of man to make discoveries and to use them, discoveries of universal physical principles, which increases the value of what is produced over the cost of production. Essentially, economy starts with purely physical values, dependent upon man's ability to discover universal physical principles and to derive and apply technologies obtained through these discoveries. That is real economics." So I want you to think about what he's describing, the power of the human discovery of principle, which allows us, when we apply it, to generate more wealth than it cost us to produce it. That's profit, and that's economics. Now this, as Vernadsky also came to realize, is the unique nature of human life. Now I want to zero in just for a second on what LaRouche hammered at, which is our ability to make discoveries of true principles of the universe. Now I want you to think, how do we do that? Unfortunately, schools don't teach us how to do that. They teach us how to memorize something, but they don't teach us how to actually make the discovery. But think about it. How did we come to discover electromagnetism, or the fact that matter is made up of what we call the chemical elements? How do we come to discover universal gravitation? Did we see them? What does gravitation look like? Could you ever draw it? Could you ever represent it? No. Gravitation has no visual existence. It has effects on things, but gravitation itself doesn't look like anything. But your mind has a mental concept of the power of gravitation, of that principle which rules and moves planets. And that concept in your mind, in our minds, must be close enough to the real thing because the universe responds to it. When we act on the concepts which exist nowhere but within our minds of electromagnetism, of the atomic nucleus, the universe responds. We are able to cause new things to happen. And this is exactly what Vernadsky was referring to when he said that thought has a profound effect on the material universe. Now, the outcome of our exertion of these principles and these new powers is that we can support more people on the planet, many more people living longer lives at a higher standard of living than we currently do today. And at the end of the 1980s, LaRouche said that if we applied all of the technologies that we had access to at that time, the potential population of the planet was 100 billion people. 100 billion people. Now, to top that, 50 years prior, Vernadsky said that the potential population of the planet was 3 trillion people. And so what LaRouche concluded economically is that the real unit of measure of economic progress is not monetary value, but a metric which he called potential relative population density. How many people could we support on a given land area if we applied all of the knowledge that we have at our fingertips today? How many people could we sustain? And that's the secret of economics. That's the potential geological force that Vernadsky discovered of the individual human mind. Now, I want you to think, what if we were to scrap all of the stupid ideas of Wall Street? What if we were to scrap all of the stupid and evil habits which have taken up residency in our policy-making institutions today about geopolitics, about destroying other nations? What if instead we were to act on what Vernadsky and Lyndon LaRouche discovered and make that the standard against which we compared our ideas for creating policies? Now that was the root of the American system of economics founded by Leibniz that began to be developed in the United States. That's also a conclusion which China has come to in its economic policy, that human beings, people, are the primary source of wealth in the country and must therefore, their opportunities to make discoveries must therefore be fostered and promoted. And when we do that, what we've seen is when that's the policy, that doesn't just benefit the nation that has the policy, it's a benefit to all of mankind. And so it points to the fact that there is something out there, there's a principle of humanity out there which is more important than your individual existence. That idea for 50 years formed the basis of Lyndon LaRouche's not only his economic discoveries, but his policy making. And he worked with presidents and leaders, prime ministers of nations, of countries around the world to develop policies, including the United States, to foster the development of higher levels of creative potential in the population. So that's basically what I wanted to go through. I'd like to discuss that. I'd like to hear people's thoughts on that, on the strategic situation. But just to underscore the importance of our conference coming up, we are at a unique moment of history. I know there's a lot of pessimism out there. In a sense, it's warranted, but in another sense, it's not. It's terrible. It's a terrible disease. And we have to break it because we're at a moment of history which is rare. And it's such a moment where the current institutions of power have lost their grip. And therefore, we have a chance to create a new dynamic in the human population by circulating and truthful, powerful ideas that could form the basis for a new society among as large a portion of the human population as possible. And that's the point of our conference. So I think I'll leave it there.